Well, joining me now is another good friend of ours, Peter Baker, MS Now political analyst and chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Trump was his charming self last night. Thanks to that clip, we got proof of that. But look, the reviews are in for his second chance at the Correspondents' Dinner speech. And much like his approval numbers, Peter, they are not great. So let's take a look at some of these headlines today. And what struck you about the night? And was it worth a second go-around?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alex. Look, I love the White House Correspondents Association. I've been a member almost continuously since 1996. That's almost 30 years. But last night was a mistake. Our mission as a Correspondents Association is to defend the First Amendment rights of White House reporters to report on the president. And I just don't think we advanced that mission last night. The New York Times decided actually almost 20 years ago that we don't go to this dinner anymore because we feel it's uncomfortable and inappropriate. And I think that was long before Trump came along. That's not about Trump specifically. It's just it felt wrong to our editors at that point. And I think last night showed why. I mean, let's just think about this week alone, Alex. Let's just walk through it for a second, if you don't mind. On Tuesday, President Trump's lawyers were in court in Miami in a lawsuit against the BBC, trying to punish the BBC for its coverage. On Wednesday, Trump's lawyers were in court in Tampa. I was there. I'm one of the defendants, along with my colleagues Sue Craig and Russ Boutner, in another lawsuit he's filed against the New York Times and Penguin Random House, because he doesn't like the coverage that he received. On Thursday, other colleagues of mine from the New York Times were in court in New York because the Trump Justice Department tried to subpoena 5 journalists, and including, by the way, 2 of the wives of those journalists and the mother of one of those journalists, in an effort to try to, as my executive editor put it, a brazen, naked attempt to intimidate the press. And then on Friday, the White House Correspondents Association invites President Trump, the same President Trump, to a dinner that's supposed to be about the First Amendment. This doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem in sync. And I think this is, just shows that this dinner has, long since passed its sell-by date, and we ought to be rethinking it.
It's extraordinary. The gloves are really off for him because you remember he never attended a White House Correspondents' Dinner during his first term. So you have to wonder what's changed. He does seem completely unharnessed, if you will, during the second term on every level. But let's get back to what happened with the New York Times, because today, what you had mentioned there, the Times put out those 2 new headlines about the jet, including one about a credible Iran threat. And that's what prompted the plane swap during the NATO summit. What can you tell us about these new headlines?
Yeah, I think that, look, when the president switched planes in Ankara from the new plane donated by the nation of Qatar back to the original Air Force One, our reporters reported that there was a concern over security and that the new plane isn't, equipped with some of the same countermeasures that the traditional plane is. That's what got the president so mad that the Justice Department issued subpoenas against the writers of that story. Well, the new story tells us that there was actually a very specific threat that the government felt was credible from Iranian proxy groups that were targeting the president and the plane. That's not something that they had acknowledged publicly prior to this. And that gives us a little bit more understanding of what happened there in Ankara. And listen, this is why we have reporters. This is why we have news organizations to report on issues of importance to the public that the government may or may not want people to know. That's this system, and that's why I think these subpoenas were fortunately being withdrawn after a judge raked the Justice Department over the coals for violating policy and just handling things in a sloppy fashion. But that doesn't mean that's going to stop the Trump administration from continuing to find ways to try to intimidate or pressure the independent media.
Okay, well, let's stick with the Middle East on another important story. And we're going to talk about Trump's tentative nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia, because this agreement would allow American companies to run commercial nuclear power plants on Saudi soil, but only if the Arab kingdom agrees to normalize relations with Israel by joining the Abraham Accords. Now, Peter, the White House denies Israel requested this contingency, but if that didn't happen, why is the president insisting on it, and are the Saudis likely to comply?
Well, this is a really interesting story, and I'm glad you're focusing on it because, in fact, this was what the Biden administration tried to negotiate when he was in office. Actually, they were going to have a deal with the Saudis to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel, and in exchange, one of the things that Saudi Arabia would get out of it would be this civil nuclear cooperation agreement. Well, that negotiation was blown up on October 7th because of the Hamas attack on Israel. And what the president seemed to do at first this week was say, I'm going to give you the nuclear deal anyway, without any conditions with regard to Israel. And then a day later, suddenly says, no, actually, there is the same condition that Biden was going to require, which is normalization of relations with Israel. Well, that's not something Saudi Arabia seems prepared to do. Saudi Arabia has said that they will not consider normalization with Israel until there is some sort of a credible path forward to resolve the issue with the Palestinians. And so suddenly this deal that they announced with great hullabaloo this week is now, of course, sidelined because that's not where the Saudis are and doesn't look like they're going to be there. So it's odd and curious why the president went forward with an agreement, knowing that he was going to put a condition on it that the Saudis wouldn't accept, or changing his mind and putting the condition on it after it was first signed.
So why does the White House want to do this deal at all? And how is it beneficial to the U.S.? Might it work as some sort of a deterrence to Iranian nuclear ambitions?
Well, that's why the Saudis are interested in it. The Saudis are interested for a couple of reasons, but one of which, of course, is to make sure that they can counter the Iranians. Secondly, they're looking to diversify their energy, plans, given the future of fossil fuels going forward. But it doesn't seem like the president got anything out of the deal until he suddenly then, imposed the Israel normalization condition on it. It seemed like he was just willing to give it to them. Now, there are people who will remind us that the Saudis are in business with some members of President Trump's family, including Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. That certainly raises suspicions on the part of some people about what's going on here, because it didn't seem like until he mentioned the Israel thing that there was anything in it for the United States, other than for perhaps some of our companies that do, do nuclear power. So, he hasn't really answered questions on this other than to say that he always intended to require normalization with Israel. But then why announce a deal that didn't actually have the Saudis agreeing to that?